The quarter hit the marble floor and spun. It made that particular sound, thin, bright, humiliating. The kind of sound that fills a room even when the room is already full of other sounds. The espresso machine, the low jazz and from the ceiling speakers, the soft murmur of lunch conversation. All of it stopped in the way that sound stops when something more interesting happens. Not silence exactly. Just attention. Nolan Archer didn't move. He stood at the front counter of the Magnolia Grand Hotel's restaurant, the Hensley Room, with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the man who had just flicked his change off the edge of the counter and watched it scatter. 3 quarters, a dime, 2 pennies, 87 cents. The coins lay on the polished marble like an accusation. The man behind the counter was named Preston Gayle. He wore a white dress shirt with a manager's pin on the lapel, gold-colored. The kind of thing that makes a certain type of person feel larger than they are. Preston Gayle was 34 years old and had been the food and beverage manager of the Hensley Room for 11 months. 11 months was long enough for him to feel like he owned something he didn't own. "Sir," Preston Gayle said, and the way he said it, the syllable landed like a door closing. "There's a dress code." Nolan Archer was wearing dark work pants, boots with dried mud on the left heel, a gray canvas jacket that had seen better decades. He had driven 4 hours that morning. He had not slept well. He was 61 years old, and he had the kind of face that had stopped being young a long time ago and had arrived somewhere else, weathered, still, patient in a way that unsettled people who weren't used to being looked at calmly. "I'm aware," Nolan said. "We have a standard," Preston Gayle continued, and now he was looking at Nolan's jacket the way people look at things they intend to dismiss. "For the dining room, I'm sure you understand. What's the standard?" Nolan asked. Preston Gayle smiled. It was not a hospitable smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to enjoy himself. Business casual, at minimum. "This is a 4-star establishment. I see, there's a diner on 5th, about 6 blocks east. They'd be happy to help you." The woman at the hostess stand, young, dark-haired, name tag that said Brianna, looked down at her reservation book, not because anything in it needed looking at. Because she had learned in her 7 months at the Hensley Room that looking somewhere else was safer. 2 tables near the window had gone quiet. A man in a blue suit was watching from behind his water glass. Nolan Archer reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and set something on the counter. A folded piece of paper. He didn't unfold it. He just set it there and left his fingers resting on top of it. "I'd like a table for one," he said, "near the window if there's availability." Preston Gayle looked at the folded paper the way you look at something you don't intend to pick up. "Sir, I've already explained." "You have," Nolan said. "Pick a table." The stillness in Preston Gayle's face shifted. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. He was a man who understood status in the way that limited men understand it. Through surface signals, through the vocabulary of expensive things. The watch, the shoes, the cut of the jacket. Nolan Archer had none of those signals. Therefore, in Preston Gayle's arithmetic, Nolan Archer had no standing. This is what prejudice looks like when it's comfortable. When it doesn't think it has to explain itself. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Preston Gayle says. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way managers say things they've said before and expect to work again. Nolan picked up the folded paper. He held it for a moment. He looked at Preston Gayle the way a man looks at something he's already decided how to handle. "All right," Nolan said. He put the paper back in his pocket. He walked to a table near the window and sat down. The silence that followed was the kind that makes everyone in a room suddenly interested in their own hands. Preston Gayle came around the counter fast. His shoes were loud on the marble. Brianna watched him pass and then looked back at her reservation book and pressed her lips together. "Sir." Preston Gayle stopped at the edge of Nolan's table. His voice had dropped, which was its own kind of escalation. "I asked you to leave." "You did," Nolan agreed. He picked up the menu. It was heavy, the kind of menu that signals expense, with a dark leather cover and thick cream-colored pages inside. He opened it. "This is private property." I will call security." Nolan looked up from the menu. His expression was not confrontational. It was not afraid. It was something harder to process than either of those things. It was simply present, like a man who had decided to take up the exact amount of space he was owed and not 1 inch more. "The salmon," he said. "Is it Atlantic or Pacific?" Preston Gayle stared at him. "It matters," Nolan said. "For the preparation. Atlantic runs richer. Pacific is cleaner on the finish. I don't. Ask the kitchen. I'll wait. Something moved through Preston Gayle's face. It started at his jaw and worked up. He was not a man who processed being ignored gracefully. He had a specific idea of how the world worked, of who had the right to make requests and who had the obligation to comply with them. And Nolan Archer was violating that idea in a way that Preston Gayle could not quite name but absolutely felt. He walked away, not to the kitchen, to the front desk. Nolan watched the menu. The salmon was listed at $32. Below it, a note, locally sourced, seasonal preparation. He turned the page. There was a roasted duck, a lamb chop, a pasta with a name in Italian that translated to something with truffle. The prices were serious. The wine list began at $90 a bottle. Brianna appeared at the table. She was holding a notepad, and she looked like she'd made a decision about something. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" she said quietly. Nolan looked up. "Water's fine. And coffee, if it's fresh." "It is." She wrote it down. She did not look toward the front desk. "I'm sorry about." She stopped. Started again. "The salmon is Atlantic. They switched suppliers about 3 months ago." "That's good to know," Nolan said. She nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. There was a specific kind of dignity in how she moved. The dignity of someone doing the right thing in a place where the right thing cost them something. Preston Gayle came back with 2 people. One was a security guard named, according to his badge, Clifton, heavyset, late 40s, who had the look of a man who had been in this situation before and found it unpleasant in a new way this time. The other was a woman in a dark lace blare. Hotel management from the look of her. Her name was Sandra Oates. She was the assistant general manager of the entire property, and she had come down from the 3rd floor because Preston Gayle had called her and described, in his words, a situation. Sandra Oates saw Nolan Archer sitting at the table with the menu open and his hands folded on top of it, and something shifted in her face. Not recognition exactly, something more like wariness. "Sir," she said, approaching carefully, "I'm Sandra Oates, assistant general manager. Is there something I can help you with?" "Nolan Archer," he said. He did not stand. He extended his hand across the table and she shook it, which Preston Gayle watched with visible displeasure. "I was hoping for lunch. Your colleague has had some concerns about my presence, Mr. Archer." Sandra Oates looked at Preston Gayle, then back at Nolan. "Can I ask what brings you to the Hensley Room today?" "I was in the area," Nolan said. "I have some business with the property. I thought I'd eat first." "What kind of business?" Nolan reached into his jacket again. This time he unfolded the paper. He set it flat on the table and turned it so Sandra Oates could read it. She read it. The color did not drain from her face. It did something more complicated than that. It rearranged. Preston Gayle was watching her face when it happened, and he knew, the way people know things before they understand them, that something had gone wrong. Not wrong for the restaurant, wrong for him specifically. "Mr. Archer," Sandra Oates said, and her voice had changed registers completely. "I was not informed you would be coming today." "I know," Nolan said. "I wanted to see the operation as it runs normally." Sandra Oates straightened. She looked at the document on the table for one more moment, a document that bore, at the top, the name of Whitmore Capital Group, and below that, the words transfer of ownership, effective, and below that, a date. And then she looked at Preston Gayle. "Preston," she said. "What is that?" Preston Gayle asked. His voice had a new quality in it, something that had not been there before, something between confusion and the beginning of understanding how badly things could go. "This is Nolan Archer," Sandra Oates said. Each word was placed carefully, the way you place something fragile. "He is the new principal owner of the Hensley Room and of the Magnolia Grand Hotel, as of last Friday." The room had gone completely still, not performatively still, actually still. The man in the blue suit had put down his water glass. The couple by the far wall were looking without pretending not to. Brianna had come back from the kitchen with a coffee cup and had stopped walking when she heard the words. Preston Gayle looked at Nolan Archer. Nolan Archer looked at the menu. "The salmon," Nolan said, to no one in particular, "I'll have that." What followed was not a scene. Nolan Archer had not come to the Hensley Room for a scene, but Preston Gayle was not done. That was the thing about men like Preston Gayle. They don't stop when they should stop, because stopping would require them to admit, even privately, that they were wrong, and that is the one thing they are constitutionally unable to do. "There must be some mistake," Preston Gayle said. He was looking at Sandra Oates, but he was talking about Nolan. The way you talk around a person when you've decided they don't merit being spoken to directly. There isn't, Sandra Oates said. The acquisition was still pending review. Legal was still. It closed Friday, she said, quietly, firmly. I received the notification. I should have briefed the floor managers. That's on me. She said the last part, looking at Nolan Archer, and Nolan gave a small nod that meant, we'll talk about that later. Preston Gayle turned to look at Nolan fully for the first time. Really look at him. Not as a problem to be removed. As something else. As the thing that was about to determine what his next several years looked like. I didn't know, Preston Gayle said. It was the wrong thing to say. Not because it was false, it was probably true. But because it meant, if I had known, I would have treated you differently. Which meant the treatment itself wasn't the problem, in Preston Gayle's accounting. The information gap was the problem. If he'd had the right information, he would have behaved correctly. Which meant he thought his behavior was contingent. Which meant he had learned nothing. Nolan heard all of that in 4 words. I know you didn't, Nolan said. He closed the menu and set it on the table. That's why I came without calling. Brianna set the coffee down in front of him. She did it carefully. She looked at him for a moment and then walked away without saying anything else, and the not saying was its own kind of eloquence. Mr. Gayle, Nolan said. He said the name with neither warmth nor coldness, just accuracy. How long have you been in hospitality? Preston Gayle blinked. 11 years, 11 years. Nolan nodded slowly. Long time to not learn the first rule. And what's that? Preston Gayle asked. He was trying to recover some authority, and his voice was not cooperating. You treat every person who walks through that door like they own the place, Nolan said, because some of them do. The quiet in the room had weight now. The man in the blue suit looked down at his plate. The couple by the far wall exchanged a look. Preston Gayle stood very still. The coins, Nolan said. He looked at the floor near the front counter, where the 87 cents still lay scattered on the marble. Would you mind? Preston Gayle looked at the coins. He looked at Nolan. He looked at Sandra Oates, who looked steadily back at him and gave him nothing. He walked to the counter. He crouched down. He picked up the quarters first, then the dime, then the 2 pennies, and he held them in his palm and stood back up. He walked back to Nolan's table and held out his hand. Nolan looked at the coins in Preston Gayle's palm. Keep them, he said. You're going to need them. Nolan Archer ate his lunch alone. The salmon was good. Atlantic, as Brianna had said, with a butter and caper preparation that was careful and confident. The coffee had been freshened twice without him asking. The table near the window had a view of the hotel's small courtyard garden, and someone had planted camellias along the far wall, deep red, the kind of red that looks deliberate. He had bought the Magnolia Grand Hotel because it was undervalued, and because he understood hotels, though some people understand music. Not just what they sounded like, but why, the underlying structure of a thing, what made it work and what made it fail. Nolan Archer had grown up in a house with no dishwasher. He had worked his first job at 14 bussing tables at a place outside Memphis that didn't have a name people would recognize. He had put himself through 2 years of community college and then transferred and then worked and saved and invested and made decisions that most people thought were too risky and a few people thought were brilliant, and which turned out, over 35 years, to be correct often enough to matter. He had built things. He had fixed things. He had walked into rooms where people looked at him and made their calculation and came up with the wrong number, and he had learned a long time ago that correcting them wasn't his responsibility. The work was his responsibility. The rest took care of itself eventually. He was not angry at Preston Gayle. He had been briefly in the way that a body is briefly cold when you step into a winter morning. Automatically, unavoidably. But the anger had passed through him and left something cleaner behind. He was tired of Preston Gayle, which was different from being angry. Tired in the deep way, the way that accumulates across a lifetime. Sandra Oates found him after lunch, in the hotel lobby, looking at the wall where previous ownership had hung a series of landscape paintings that he was already planning to replace. Mr. Archer, she said. She was carrying a legal pad and a property binder, which meant she had pulled herself together since the dining room and was ready to be professional. He appreciated that. Sandra. He turned from the paintings. Tell me about the staff. She took a breath. The property has 47 full-time employees. The Hensley Room alone accounts for 14, including kitchen. The general manager is David Wren. He's been with the property for 6 years and She paused. He's good. I want to be transparent about that. He had no idea this visit was happening today. Same as me. I know, Nolan said. I'm not looking to empty the house. She looked relieved and then caught herself looking relieved and then composed her face into something more neutral. He liked her for that. Preston Gayle, he said. Yes. How long has he been a problem? She was quiet for a moment. He has strong performance numbers. The dining room runs efficiently under him, but there have been complaints, guest complaints and one from a prep cook, about the manner in which he speaks to staff. What kind of manner? Dismissive. Targeted. The complaint from the prep cook was about a specific incident where Preston made a comment in front of the kitchen that the employee felt was racially motivated. She was looking at her legal pad but not reading from it. It was investigated. HR found insufficient evidence to act formally. Preston was given a verbal counseling and a note in his file. Nolan looked at the landscape paintings, mountains, a river. Someone's idea of what people wanted to look at. One verbal counseling, he said. Yes. The cook is still here? She is. Her name is Yolanda Ferris. She's been with us for 4 years. One of our best line cooks, according to Chef Delaney. Nolan nodded. He made a mental note of the name. Not to do anything to her specifically, just to make sure someone had at some point recognized that she was still there, that she had stayed. The dining room staff, he said. The young woman at the hostess stand, Brianna Calloway. She's been here 7 months. She brought me coffee without being told to, after your colleague told me to leave. He looked at Sandra Oates. That took something. Sandra Oates wrote something on her legal pad. Schedule a staff meeting, Nolan said. All dining room employees, I'll speak to them tomorrow morning before service. Yes, sir, and call legal. I want a formal review of all guest complaints and HR incidents over the past 3 years, not a summary. The actual files. I'll have them pulled today. He looked at the paintings again. These come down this week. I'll have something new in here by the end of the month. Of course. Sandra paused. Mr. Archer, for what it's worth. What happened today in the dining room? I'm sorry you experienced that. He was quiet for a moment. I've experienced it my whole life, he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true, and he said it the way true things get said when you're tired of dressing them up. The goal isn't for me to never experience it. The goal is to build something where the next person who walks in, whoever they are, whatever they look like, whatever they're wearing, gets treated like a human being from the first second to the last. Sandra Oates looked at him, not with pity, with something that was closer to recognition. That's the business, he said. That's the whole business. Preston Gayle's office was on the lower level, past the kitchen, in a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old coffee. It was a small office, a desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with the week's reservation numbers written in blue marker, a plant on the windowsill that had not been watered recently enough. He was sitting behind the desk when Nolan Archer knocked on the open door. Preston Gayle looked up. He had the look of a man who had spent the last hour and a half making calculations and not liking any of the answers. Nolan pulled out the other chair and sat down without being invited. I'm not going to make a speech, Nolan said. I know you're expecting one. Preston Gayle said nothing. You're a capable manager. The numbers show that. I've looked at your metrics, table turns, food cost control, reservation management. You know how to run a floor. He paused. You don't know how to see people. Preston opened his mouth. Not finished, Nolan said without raising his voice. Preston closed his mouth. There's a cook in your kitchen named Yolanda Ferris. She filed a complaint 14 months ago. It was investigated and closed. She stayed anyway. Do you know what it takes to stay somewhere after something like that? He looked at Preston Gayle steadily. It takes believing that at some point, something will be different. That's an act of faith. And the people she extends that faith to don't deserve it yet, but she extended it anyway because she needed the work and she was good at her job and she was not going to let someone like you take that from her. The plant on the windowsill needed water. Nolan noticed it and filed it away. What I'm building here is not going to work the way things worked before, he said. I need managers who can tell the difference between a guest who needs to be asked to leave and a guest who needs to be seen. That distinction is not complicated. It is not ambiguous. It is the job. He stood. I'll be reviewing staffing decisions over the next 30 days, he said. That includes management positions. I haven't made any decisions yet. He looked at Preston Gayle one more time. Not unkindly, but without softening anything. "Water the plant," he said. "It's almost gone." The staff meeting the next morning was at 7:30, before the breakfast service. 14 people in the back room off the kitchen, servers, hosts, a couple of line cooks who had been pulled from prep. They stood or sat around a folding table and looked at Nolan Archer with the particular wariness of people who have recently learned that everything they thought they knew about their workplace had shifted. He stood at the front of the room without notes. "My name is Nolan Archer," he said. "As of last Friday, I own this property. I'm going to tell you what I told your assistant general manager yesterday because I think you should hear it directly." He looked around the room. Brianna Calloway was near the back, hands folded. Yolanda Ferris, he identified her by process of elimination, was standing to the left, arms crossed, expression careful. "The business of hospitality is making people feel like they belong," he said. "Not some people, every person who walks through that door, regardless of what they look like, or how they're dressed, or what their balance is. That is the entire job. Everything else, the food, the ambiance, the reviews, all of it is in service of that one thing." He paused. "Yesterday, something happened in this dining room that did not reflect that value. I'm not going to relitigate it. I'm not going to ask anyone to explain themselves or justify what they did or didn't do. You were all put in a position that wasn't fair, and you made the choices you had available to you given the environment you've been operating in." Brianna Calloway was looking at him. "One of you," he said, "made a different choice, under pressure, without knowing who I was or what the outcome would be." She brought a man who'd been told to leave a cup of coffee because he looked like someone who might need it. He didn't look at Brianna when he said it. He looked at the table. "That's the job," he said. "That's what I'm here to build." No one said anything for a moment. Then one of the line cooks, a man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the posture of someone who had been standing in front of a stove for 30 years, raised his hand. "You gonna fire Gayle?" he asked. No preamble. Direct. Nolan looked at him. "What's your name?" "Ferris," the man said. "Everett Ferris. I'm Yolanda's father." He said it without embarrassment, without apology. "She called me last night, told me what happened." The room was very quiet. Nolan Archer looked at Everett Ferris for a long moment. "I haven't made that decision yet," he said. "But I've made others. I've decided that every complaint, everyone, gets a real review. I've decided that no one in this building should have to wonder whether staying was worth it." He paused. "I've decided that the people who show up to do this job right deserve to be in a place that does right by them." Everett Ferris nodded, slow, deliberate. The nod of someone who has heard enough promises in his life to know the difference between one that's real and one that isn't. He seemed to decide this one was real. 3 weeks later, the landscape paintings came down. Nolan had commissioned a local artist, a woman from the neighborhood who painted in oils, whose work had been hanging in a gallery 2 blocks from the hotel for 3 years without ever being purchased by the right person. The pieces she made for the Hensley Room were large and warm, faces and hands and light through curtained windows, the kind of paintings that made a room feel inhabited rather than decorated. The salmon was still on the menu, Atlantic. The prep had been refined. The plant in Preston Gayle's former office had been moved to the dining room near the window. Someone had started watering it. It was beginning slowly to look like it intended to stay. Brianna Calloway had been promoted to lead host. She had taken the news with the composure of someone who had been expecting something, just not sure what. She had shaken Nolan's hand and then excused herself and gone to the back for 5 minutes. And when she came back, her eyes were slightly red, and her expression was entirely professional. And Nolan had looked at her and understood that she had spent 7 months in a place that had not quite seen her, and being seen had taken something out of her in the best way. Yolanda Ferris was still on the line. She hadn't asked for anything. She had just come to work every day since the meeting and done what she always did, which was cook with the kind of focused precision that makes a kitchen run like a conversation between people who trust each other. Nolan Archer stopped by the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks in. Yolanda was working the fish station, and she looked up when he appeared at the pass. "How's the salmon running?" he asked. She looked at him. Not with surprise, with the measured attention of someone deciding how much to say. "Good," she said, "clean. We've been getting consistent cuts. Good." He started to turn. "Mr. Archer." He turned back. Yolanda Ferris looked at him across the stainless steel. Her expression was not grateful exactly. It was something more durable than gratitude. "Thank you for staying," she said. "For eating your lunch. For not," she stopped. Chose the next words carefully. "For not letting him run you off." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't going to do that," he said, simply, as though it had never been a real possibility. And maybe it hadn't. Maybe there are people for whom being told to leave a table has stopped working as a deterrent. Not because they're stubborn, not because they're making a point, but because they have spent too many years building things in rooms where they weren't expected to be, and they know by now that the room doesn't get to decide. Yolanda Ferris nodded and turned back to the fish. The kitchen hummed around her. Outside, through the restaurant windows, the camellias were still red against the courtyard wall, holding their color against the end of the season the way certain things do, not by force, just by nature, just because that's what they were made to be.